Welcome back to Galaxy Recaps. Today we'll be diving into an action thriller film titled Contraband. Enjoy the recap. The movie opens with a helicopter soaring over the sea, radioing officers on boats below as they clear the way to inspect a vessel approaching the dock. Andy, noticing this, quickly alerts his friend Walter, urging him to grab their stash. Acting fast, Andy hurls a duffel bag packed with drugs overboard just as the police close in. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, Chris Faraday is at a wedding celebrating his good friend Danny. As the festivities continue, we meet Chris's wife Kate and his friend Sebastian. Their conversation shifts to Chris's past as the best smuggler in New Orleans. Later, when Chris steps out, a man named Church approaches him, curious about his current life. Chris shares that he now owns a company installing security alarms, leading a quiet life away from his smuggling days. But Church hints at Chris's family legacy. His father, once locked up for similar operations, had worked with Church. He even offers Chris a way back into the game if he ever feels tempted. The scene shifts back to Andy and Walter driving through the night to confront their boss after losing the drugs. Their boss, Tim Briggs, pulls up beside them to hear their excuse. After listening, Tim seemingly steps away, but instead he rams his car into Andy's, showing he's not letting this slide. Not long after, Kate receives a distressing call about her brother. She, Chris, and Sebastian rush to the hospital, finding Andy injured in a hospital bed and Walter in surgery. Andy admits to Chris that he had to dump 10 pounds of cocaine when customs was onto him. Determined to protect his family, Chris consults Sebastian to dig up details on Tim Briggs. On their way home, Chris assures Kate that he'll handle the situation and that Andy's problem won't linger. The next day, Chris is in the middle of a client meeting when he gets a call from Sebastian, who reveals that Briggs was recently released from prison and tells Chris where to find him. Chris wastes no time and heads straight to the location. Upon arriving, he approaches Briggs, who immediately recognizes him, hinting at their shared history. Knowing the stakes, Chris is there to negotiate, hoping to keep Briggs from exacting revenge on Andy. Briggs demands a hefty $700,000 from Chris, the full value of the lost drugs. Chris tries to reason with him, but Briggs isn't interested in Chris's reputation. He wants his money. Frustrated, Chris walks away and heads to see Andy, only to find him hurriedly packing. He reveals that Briggs visited Walter the previous night and ended his life. Chris lectures Andy, making sure he understands the weight of his choices and how no one had ever guided him the right way. But Andy, reckless as ever, seems indifferent to the severity of his actions. Determined, Chris grabs his pistol and storms to Briggs' house. Briggs greets him coldly, and Chris proposes a month to pay him back, but Briggs only grants 2 weeks, even threatening Chris's family if he doesn't deliver. Furious, Chris warns Briggs never to mention his wife or kids again. A scuffle breaks out, witnessed by Briggs's daughter, before the tension settles. Later, Chris watches ships from a distance, knowing that smuggling is the only way to make that kind of money fast. He reluctantly tells Kate he has no choice but to return to the smuggling world. Kate is distraught, but with no alternatives, Chris is resolute. He visits his father, who's proud that Chris had once left the smuggling life to run a legitimate business. But understanding the urgency, his father offers him a position on the cargo ship he used to use for smuggling. With the plan in place, Chris briefs Sebastian but insists they won't deal in drugs. Instead, they'll smuggle $15 million in counterfeit U.S. currency from Panama. Chris reviews the ship's manifest and reaches out to a contact in Panama, notifying him of the incoming shipment. That night, Chris heads to the dock with his family, giving them each a heartfelt goodbye before boarding the cargo ship. As the ship prepares to depart, Chris and Andy stow their duffel bags in a hidden wall compartment. Soon after, the captain named Camp spots Chris aboard and immediately demotes him, ordering his men to keep a close watch on him. Chris later wakes from a quick power nap and resumes work, pretending to clean rugs. But he uses the opportunity to steal a crucial map from the captain's drawer without getting noticed. With the map in hand, he grabs a welding torch and secretly cuts a large opening in a wall. Shortly after, he meets up with his crew who are helping him smuggle the counterfeit money. Chris warns them to keep the captain out of the plan, and then leads them downstairs to reveal the massive hole he's created in the wall where they'll hide the cash. While they discuss the next steps, the ship's second-in-command suddenly appears, forcing them to quickly conceal Andy inside the compartment and seal the entrance. The second-in-command orders them to scatter after a brief inspection, noticing nothing out of place. Once he leaves, Chris explains the plan to the crew in detail. He'll drive out, grab the cash, and return to the ship during rush hour to avoid detection. Tariq is skeptical, thinking there won't be enough time, so Chris tells Olaf to create a minor mechanical issue to delay the ship's departure and buy them time. Back home, Chris's family is under surveillance by Briggs and his thugs. Briggs brazenly knocks on the front door, demanding to speak with Kate while his men barge into the house, trashing everything in sight as they pin her down. Tensions run high when one of Briggs's thugs accidentally fires a gun. Briggs, unfazed, tells his men to leave the scene. Back at the Panama Canal, the ship is on the verge of docking. Chris is focused on sabotaging the vessel to create a delay, and is soon called to the deck to take a disturbing phone call from his wife. She's clearly shaken, and he advises her to call Sebastian, who wastes no time heading to the family's aid. Meanwhile, the captain, unaware of Chris's interference, orders the ship's crew to cut speed in preparation for docking. But Olaf's sabotage backfires slightly. The ship is still barreling toward the dock. The captain panics, shouting for the anchors to drop. Chris jumps into action, releasing the anchors, but the vessel still crashes lightly against the dock. Furious, the captain inspects the engine room, discovering a jammed propeller and suspecting foul play. Taking advantage of the captain's distraction, Chris heads back to retrieve the duffel bags he stashed in the wall. With the onboard chaos temporarily handled, he, Danny, and Andy slip into the city. As they navigate the bustling streets, Chris worries about his family's safety and checks in to ensure they're all right. They eventually reach their contact point and enter a shop where they're led to a hidden back room where Edwin, their Panama contact, awaits to discuss the next step in their high-stakes plan. Chris asks Edwin if he has the van ready with the cash, and Edwin assures him it's all set. Edwin then shows Chris the uncut fake US dollars, but Chris is suspicious. Examining the money, he realizes something is wrong. He tells Andy to wait and heads deeper into the shop, grabbing a chemical to test the bills. After a drop of the liquid turns blue on contact, Chris angrily confronts Edwin for not using starch-free paper as requested, reminding him he wanted it printed the same way as last time. Frustrated, Chris decides they need to go straight to the warehouse where the bills were made. Edwin warns him it's a bad idea, but with only an hour left to return, Chris presses forward. Meanwhile, back on the ship, the captain grows suspicious and starts searching for Chris. Over at Briggs's place, a knock on the door reveals Sebastian, who warns Briggs to stay away from Chris's family. Sebastian hints that if Briggs had hired a skilled smuggler initially, the package would have arrived without issues, revealing his double-dealing nature. The scene shifts back to Chris, Danny, and Andy, who nervously approach the factory. Chris reassures his friends that he'll handle things. As they arrive, Andy listens to a voicemail from Briggs, who orders him to bring the real cash to a specific address in Panama, threatening his sister and her children if he doesn't comply. Tension rising, Andy opens their bag of genuine money. Inside the factory, Chris and Danny meet Gonzalo, an old acquaintance of Chris's, while Danny steps out to retrieve the van. As Chris and Gonzalo discuss business, Gonzalo casually mentions he's planning a heist on an armored truck and invites Chris to join. Outside, Danny goes to the van only to realize that Andy has vanished along with the bag of money. Inside, Gonzalo tells Chris he can keep the supernotes for free if he participates in the truck job. When Danny returns with news of the missing money and Andy, Gonzalo's demeanor shifts. He and his men aim their guns at Chris, feeling disrespected by the unexpected change in plans. Chris, thinking quickly, asks Gonzalo if the original offer still stands, agreeing to join the truck heist in exchange for the supernotes. Gonzalo agrees but confiscates their wallets and IDs as collateral. Back on the ship, the captain contacts Olaf, giving him only 10 minutes to prep the vessel for departure. Olaf informs Chris, who urges him to stall for as long as possible. As part of the heist, Chris and the crew position themselves to intercept the armored truck. Once it approaches, they maneuver into its path, forcing a collision that flips the van. Gonzalo's men rush in, breach the truck, and eliminate the guards protecting the shipment. Quickly, the crew begins unloading the contents of the truck, while Tarek stays back, paying off locals to delay work in the area, giving Chris enough time to grab the supernotes. Gonzalo pulls a painting from its frame, revealing hidden items, but their timing is off. Police arrive on the scene almost instantly. A fierce shootout erupts, with waves of police reinforcements overwhelming Gonzalo's crew. One by one, his men fall under the relentless assault. Despite taking out a few officers, Gonzalo realizes he can't hold out. The driver of their pickup is killed, and with Gonzalo the last one standing, he jumps into the truck. Chris and Danny hop onto the back as bullets fly, and a high-speed chase follows. The cops are temporarily blocked when a bus cuts off their path, allowing Gonzalo, Chris, and Danny to escape. Meanwhile, Andy returns to the ship, where Tarek anxiously asks about Chris and the others. Having managed to evade the cops, Chris and Danny finally regroup with their van, tossing the painting in as they prepare to leave. They retrieve their IDs, but Gonzalo, wounded and desperate, begs them to take him to the hospital. With no time to spare, they agree, speeding off as the cops swarm the area. Gonzalo succumbs to his injuries en route, and Danny retrieves their wallets before dumping Gonzalo's body. Back on the ship, Captain Camp calls Tarek, ordering him back and instructing his men to search anyone coming on board. As they arrive at the dock, Chris floors it, and Tarek opens a shipping container for them to hide the van. However, just as Tarek begins closing the container, a crane unexpectedly lifts it, leaving the doors partially open. Danny scrambles to secure the doors while the container is lowered. Working quickly, Tarek and Danny unload the supernotes, moving them discreetly into the hidden compartment Chris created. Meanwhile, customs agents approach Captain Camp, requesting an inspection of any containers arriving late. As Captain Camp searches, Tariq and Danny stealthily transfer the counterfeit money into the concealed wall compartment. Chris, noticing Camp nearby, takes evasive action, using parkour to avoid detection. Camp opens the last container but finds nothing suspicious, allowing Chris to make his way back to the hidden room. In a fit of rage, Chris confronts Andy, demanding to know where the money went. Andy confesses he bought drugs with it, hiding them in the ceiling. Enraged, Chris throws the drugs at Andy, but when Andy shows him the voicemail where Briggs threatened his family, Chris softens slightly. He contacts Kate to check on her, ensuring her safety as he updates Sebastian on the situation. Chris decides to throw the drugs into the sea, hoping to avoid further complications. Elsewhere, Sebastian receives a visit from Church, who sternly warns him, giving him a few days to resolve matters. Realizing the stakes, Sebastian meets with Briggs, urging him to put pressure on Kate to keep Chris from abandoning the smuggling plan. Briggs doesn't need much persuasion and takes his sadistic intentions to the extreme. The scene shifts to Kate as she wraps up her day at work. Briggs suddenly crashes through the glass doors, grabbing her by the head and slamming her into more glass. He coldly warns her to ensure her husband delivers the package. Moments later, Sebastian arrives, approaching Briggs, who pretends not to recognize him and leaves. When Sebastian hugs Kate, she detects alcohol on his breath and becomes furious. Worried about him driving her kids, she promptly removes her children from his car, loading them into her vehicle before driving off, shaken and furious. Kate immediately calls Chris, telling him that Briggs warned her not to dump the package in the water. Instantly, Chris realizes something is terribly wrong, but then the call abruptly cuts off. Kate, visibly shaken, finds refuge with a friend who urges her to speak with the police. Despite the danger, Kate decides to head to Sebastian's house, sensing something off. Meanwhile, Chris learns from Andy that the drugs originally came from a man named Ruben, an old acquaintance of his, making the situation even more personal. At Sebastian's house, Kate quietly gathers her belongings, hoping to leave unnoticed. But Sebastian wakes up, urging her to stay the night. When she refuses and tries to leave, he snaps, chasing her as she locks herself in a room. Kate frantically calls Chris, but Sebastian bursts through the door, causing her to fall and hit her head. Stunned, Sebastian realizes he's gone too far, especially as he sees Chris calling back. Knowing he's in serious trouble, he answers, only for Chris to deliver a clear warning. If Sebastian goes near his family again, he's a dead man. Panicking, Sebastian contacts Captain Camp, suggesting that if the captain prevents Chris from dumping the package, he can keep Chris's share of the profits. Captain Camp agrees but warns that if he doesn't get the package location, he'll call in a full search to seize it. Acting on this, the captain heads to Chris's quarters, beginning a thorough search and threatening Chris with imprisonment when Customs and Border Protection (CBP) inevitably find the contraband. But Chris is already a step ahead. Sneaking into the captain's quarters, he manages to steal and duplicate a set of keys. Soon after, Captain Camp alerts CBP, triggering a full-scale deployment. The harbor becomes a frenzy as CBP units swarm toward the ship, prepared for an extensive search. Meanwhile, back at Sebastian's house, things take a grim turn. Sebastian, realizing the severity of his actions, covers Kate's lifeless body in plastic, wrapping her up just as the police start boarding the ship and rounding up the crew for questioning. As CBP agents begin their sweep, they inspect every inch, eventually finding the hidden compartment in the wall, but it's empty. Moving on to the van, they discover only a tarp, leaving them without enough evidence. Chris, however, is taken in for questioning, where he faces intense interrogation. At the same time, Andy, granted clearance to leave, steps off the ship, but his relief is short-lived. Briggs is lying in wait, watching as Andy makes a break for it. Within moments, Andy is cornered, caught in Briggs's trap with no clear way out. In the interrogation room, customs officers inform Chris that the person registered as the container's importer has been dead for years. Chris plays dumb, and without concrete evidence, they have no choice but to release him. Outside, he spots Briggs in a car holding Andy hostage. But when Briggs realizes the drugs aren't with Chris, he closes the window. Chris reacts fast, breaking the window, yanking Briggs out and beating him down until one of Briggs's thugs fires a shot. Forced into the car, Chris finally gives Briggs directions to the package location. Using the forged key, Chris unlocks a house, triggering a silent alarm that alerts the police. Inside, he opens a car trunk, revealing a cleaning machine. He dismantles it and starts handing over the drugs, and Briggs finally realizes just how skilled a smuggler Chris is. While Briggs and his men test the goods, Chris seizes the distraction, hijacks a car, and speeds off. Moments later, Captain Camp, who's followed them, arrives at the house only to be surprised as police pull up and arrest both him and Briggs. Chris returns home, calling out for Kate, but she's nowhere to be found. Unbeknownst to him, Sebastian has her lifeless body in his car, planning to dispose of it. When Chris goes to Sebastian's house and finds no one home, he starts to break in, noticing the broken lock. Meanwhile, Sebastian, filled with regret, heads to a construction site, intending to bury Kate in freshly poured concrete. Chris tracks him to the site, confronting Sebastian and beating him mercilessly for answers. He then hears a phone ringing near the concrete pour. Realizing Kate might be buried there, Chris frantically digs, freeing her from the concrete. Though initially lifeless, Kate miraculously regains consciousness, having only been knocked unconscious. Relieved beyond measure, Chris holds her close, finally reuniting with his wife. Tarek and Danny, on Chris's cue, retrieve the hidden supernotes from the dock, finally seeing why Chris is the best in the game. As Sebastian is sent to prison, he ends up sharing a cell with Captain Camp, a fitting twist. Meanwhile, Customs lists the van for auction since its registration was under a deceased person. Andy, spotting the opportunity, manages to buy it. Later, Tariq meets the crew at the dock, where they sell the supernotes to Church for a hefty $3 million. Church, intrigued, asks Chris if he had any involvement with the stolen painting in Panama. Chris denies it, but Church reveals the painting's true worth, a staggering $140 million. The twist? The painting is still in the van Andy just bought. As the crew heads off with a fresh fortune, the final scene shows Chris and Kate relaxing at a beach house, a testament to their upgraded life and newfound peace. With the past behind them, they've reached a new level, closing the story on a hopeful note. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.